Well, this is quite a transition from all of that gospel testimony to the application of what it means to be a gospel citizen in the United States of America, in our world. Let me say this, in any government system that you would find yourself in, because a lot of people move around the world by job or in the providence of God, you would need to apply biblical principles to know how to act and how to kind of acquit yourself. And so I want to touch on that. We've got, 20 minutes or so just to talk. And it's probably less of a sermon, but it is going to be a Bible study through the topic of God and government. Now, we've been talking about God and government once a month for several months in a row. This is number 5 in our series. And there are number 4 in our series of 5 positions. And so let me just talk you through different positions you can take as a Christian in terms of government. And each one of these positions is a position that you might find yourself wanting to be in depending on the circumstances. So it's not, you don't have to pick one and say, this is my position. You need to learn all these different positions and then learn them so that you can learn how to discern exactly how to apply them in unique situations. And we'll unpack that a little bit more as we go. First is God under government. That's position number 1. And that's based on Romans 13 and 1 Peter, where it just talks about submitting to governing authorities. We've unpacked these passages over the month, so I'm not going to belabor that, but it's the idea that your mindset is to understand that God establishes institutions like family and the armed forces and presidents and kings and institutions in the world that we are called to submit to, even secular ones. And so we're not talking about just, we submit to the born-again Christian president, but we'll submit to any president that God is appointing over us as a general rule. And the laws are there to protect us and to provide guidance and to put down, lawlessness and people who will be anarchists or try to rebel against things, because we're all born in sin. And in a sinful environment, we need the control of the government, which is called a sword. To bring people under authority. All right, so there is a real sense in which Christians have a disposition to submit. Secondly, is God over government. Now, this is a position that I talked about for a couple periods, and again, it's probably the most complicated one. And it's a position that people have taken where they've wanted to kind of change out our government, our American government, for a different one. It's the idea that we could create a Christian government. And perhaps you've heard of Calvin, who kind of established a governance in Geneva that was a Christian society. And I'm not saying that was the best thing to do or the biblical path, but it's the idea that Israel established a government and God established governance for them as a special people. So could we do that for the church? Basically, what Israel had, we want as the church, and people will kind of push that agenda. I came out of a world under Liberty University and Jerry Falwell Sr. and the moral majority. Some of you might remember all of those sort of concepts. And there's a push for kind of the idea of making a Christianized governance where the laws have to be exactly biblical for things to be righteous in the land. And that's really mixing secular and sacred principles together pretty tightly. There are other versions of that people are talking about in trends these days that are called theonomy. You can look it up later, but it's the idea of trying to apply biblical laws in the land and say that, if you violate biblical law, then you are operating against the law in a society like this. We don't live in this society now, but there are people who wish for it and push for that agenda. It's important to be aware of that. All right, number 3, and the only time we're going to have a God governance is in the millennium, by the way. So that's where it's righteous. That's what we're looking to end up in. But right now, our kingdom is not of this world. So that's sort of my point on point 2. God in government. This is the idea of a desire for having Christian leaders in government and Christians who will think through a biblical grid, a biblical lens, and try to set policy in our society, in our world around us, that reflect a Christian testimony. And again, coming from some of my background, I have been in churches that are really strong in this regard, and there are positions where you can stand against abortion, and we should. I detest abortion, in terms of it being murder, and there is standing for family, standing for monogamous marriages that are between a man and a woman. Getting the biblical vision of family right is a very important position to stand for, and that can come through Christians who are raised up in government and can be that specific salt and light. My I talked quite a bit about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I went through a biography that explained his stand inside of government, where he actually became, a Christian who was martyred, but he was martyred as much for going against Hitler and associating with that, pushback on him, probably as much as being a Christian witness and testimony. So thinking that through is important. It's important to understand that the Bible in nowhere says that we're supposed to create a Christian government here on earth. And as the New Testament church, it also does not require or enlist people to be involved in politics anywhere that I can find in Scripture. However, there are people, I believe, that are uniquely gifted and uniquely called in circumstances and training and knowledge and skill that the Lord has raised up in many places to be those kinds of leaders. The Daniels of the world, the Esthers of the world, different ones that are like statesmen. In the New Testament, you might refer to Cornelius or a few others that stood up that were uniquely positioned to take a stand for God in that way. Number 4, this is where we are tonight, is God versus government. And then the last category will be the category of God and government, and that'll be for the next time we take this up. The God versus government is where I want to anchor us and talk about a little bit. And again, I'm not a deconstructionist. I'm not trying to, and I'm not anti-foundational in any means whatsoever. And I'm very pro in terms of being an American citizen. I feel, deep patriotism, love, and loyalty to our country, deep respect for those who serve in the armed services, deep respect for Christians in governing positions. So in no way am I trying to say that we should, attack government or take it down. But the Bible is very, very clear that as a church and as a kingdom on earth that represents Christ, we will come into and under persecution. The whole storyline of the Bible is about different ones who have had to take stands at certain points, risking their life or risking their freedom for the sake of gospel witness and testimony. And there are several categories where there can be settings where you have to think about protesting, defying, speaking out, and obeying God rather than man. And so I want to talk about that a bit tonight. If you read this book, it is written by Nathan Busenitz and James Coates. And Nathan Busenitz is from the Master's Seminary and sort of the world of John MacArthur. And James Coates is a graduate from Master's Seminary a couple times, and he's a pastor in Canada. Nathan Busenitz and James in this book kind of tell their two accounts of how they dealt with different policies that were applied and enforced against each of their churches during the pandemic and COVID season. So this is real recent biographical history that you can read up on. You'll remember James Coates was hauled away to jail, taken from his family as a pastor, and up in Canada, he He stood strong for keeping the church open and preaching, even though the governing authorities in Canada, they were pretty strict and they're liberal. They became more and more volatile and ultimately called him in for questioning, and ultimately it was a sting kind of operation to incarcerate him and keep him there and jail him. As an example of what not to do, they ended up wrapping his church with, I think, 2 barricades of fences to keep people out from meeting together and things. And you'll remember John MacArthur and what was going on down in Southern California. California, under sort of the rule of Gavin Newsom as governor, there were strict policies enforced where, LA County was fining and basically giving, I think, just $1,000 a week fine for them while they met during COVID. And ultimately, Grace Church decided as an eldership to sue LA County, and they won because they were able to make the case that staying open was essential for people, for community, for fellowship, and the fallout of isolation was detrimental. They did a lot of research into the medical arena and took a position on what they believed was being purported from the news versus what was reality with COVID and statistics and things. And, I'm not standing for them and saying, hey, they did everything exactly right one way or the other. That's for all of us to think through in our own right. But they did take a very clear and very public national stand to say that the government in California was in violation of the Constitution, and the right to meet as a church was protected under the Constitution of our country. So anyway, they fought and they won that court battle, and that was of interest. What was interesting to me in both cases with James Coates and with John MacArthur and the World of Grace Community Church is that there was nuance to how they did everything. And it very much was similar to what we did here, where when it first came out, everybody was wondering, what are the implications? What is the fallout of COVID and what's going to happen? How dangerous is this? And then there was the sort of, I forget, deterring the spread. I forget exactly what it was called. What was it called? Yeah, flattening the curve and all of that, and it was timed for a set period of time, and so there was adherence to that. Both Grace Church and Grace Life up in Canada, that church, they both obeyed and yielded to those laws and those edicts that were handed down and orders that were handed down, I should say, and basically they did it. But then there was an open-ended side of it where they were saying everything has to stay this way to an indeterminate period of time, and so it was canceling church. It was canceling the ability to meet together. In Hebrews 10, 24 and 25, says that a church is called to assemble. It's called to meet together. It's called to perform the one another's. It's called to observe public baptisms. Churches are called to come under the public and gathered Scripture, where you're gathering under Scripture. The church is called the ecclesia, the called out. You're called out of your homes to gather and assemble under the Word of God with regularity, and that's essential for your soul care and for health and growth. And so convictions were born to say, this is not just a violation of the Constitution. This is not just something that we can fight constitutionally. Those are measures that people in churches took and can take. But this is a matter of obedience to Scripture and is essential for our health and for our spiritual growth. And so out of all of that, Nathan Busnitz put together a chapter. I think it's chapter 12. It's called Biblical Exceptions and Pastoral Implications. And it's the idea that, yes, we are called to submit to governing authorities, but the Bible gives clear exceptions to the rule where both in narrative or stories in the Bible and also in principles, there is a time to take a stand and meet and just obey the Lord rather than just what man says. Okay, so if you kind of roll the slides forward, I want to get to the slide that says the Bible calls believers to submit to governing authorities. God has appointed them to their various roles and responsibilities. However, there are exceptions to the rules. In the next slide, 5 categories of exceptions to submission. And exception number one is in order to do what is wrong. And here's the synopsis of it. I know we're in school right now, but just pay attention. We'll kind of roll through this quickly. When a governing authority issues a command or a decree that requires citizens to violate God's law, believers are duty-bound to obey God and disobey the government. And you say, well, where are these exceptions? Well, first of all, you have Genesis 39, 7 through 10. This one's an interesting one, and all of these are taken straight from this book. This is not my content I created, but I'll just kind of talk it through. Genesis 39, this is Joseph. Remember, he was enslaved. He had been given over by his brothers to enslavement and came under Potiphar's household. And his wife, so this is a master's wife, so it's master to slave authority. And she cast her eyes on Joseph. She said, lie with me. He would not listen to her. He ultimately refused his master's wife. He said, verse 9, he is not greater in this house than I, nor is he has kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? So he's going to obey God rather than fall prey to what he's being commanded to do. And he's also, fleeing his own flesh. Then Exodus 1, 17 through 21, you know the story of Exodus. Moses is called to be the deliverer of Israel. And ultimately, in Exodus 1, this is where you have a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. Sorry about that. This is the new Pharaoh comes into town. He didn't know Joseph, and he was being overwhelmed by the population of the Jews, and he wanted to snuff them out. It says, the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the midwives were supposed to kill off the children or have them killed as soon as they were delivered. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to him, why have you done this? And let the male children live. And the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. This is one that we could sit on for the rest of our time, because it's interesting, because they're basically pulling one over on Pharaoh, and they're saying, we're fearing God rather than telling all of the story. We're telling a different story than is actually happening. So that one's kind of interesting. There's a lot of these here. I'm not going to anchor on all of these. 1 Samuel 22:17 is the story of Ahimelech, which is the high priest of Nob, and he protected David. Remember, David was running from Saul, and he ate the showbread, and he had his men, there, and ultimately, it says the King Saul, said to the guard who stood about him, turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand is also with David. And ultimately, they wouldn't kill the priest, and Ahimelech's life was on the line because of that. Daniel 3, the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego bow to the idol of Nebuchadnezzar. And what did they say? Verse 16 of Daniel 3. O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you've set up. And they were ultimately thrown in the flaming furnace, but they survived it because of the Lord's grace. All right, exception number 2. So the first one is when you're ordered to do what is wrong. Number 2, in order to stop doing what is right. This is if governing officials command believers to stop doing what God commands them to do, they must continue in obedience to God. To fail to do what the Lord commands constitutes disobedience to him. So they have to keep obeying. Pharaoh attempted to stop Moses from leading the Israelites out of Egypt, but Moses obeyed God's directive. You see that there? He kept obeying, kept moving the children of Israel along. Daniel was commanded to stop praying for a month, but he refused and was thrown into the den of lions. The decree with Darius was written up. Daniel said, I'm going to pray 3 times anyway. He prayed and kept doing it, and 3 times a day on his knees. He prayed, verse 10. It says he got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. And ultimately he was put into the lion's den. And Darius was sad about all of this. Just moving on, Peter and the apostles refused to comply the order to stop preaching about Jesus. You remember Peter had performed the miracle and raised up the lame man at the temple and then was preaching about that. And it says, Peter says, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, you must judge. We cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard. This is the Sadducees and the council, and that was the governing authority over the land. They weren't just disobeying, evil church. They were disobeying authorities that could imprison them. Acts 5, same thing. They were preaching again, and the Sanhedrin again came after him. Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than man. The God of our fathers raised Jesus, whom you killed by hanging on a tree. All right, that's exception number 2. All right, exception number 3. We're just flying right along here. An order that contradicts another level of civil authority. Now, this is the most complicated one. This is built out of the book of Acts, and it's the concept of where Paul would appeal to Felix or appeal to higher courts rather than the lower courts. So he was able to avoid the persecution of the Sadducees and the councils. I mean, he didn't avoid it altogether. He was beaten. He was thrown in prison. He was put in the Philippian jail. But ultimately, he claimed Roman citizenship again and again as a way to appeal up and avoid being persecuted on levels and continuing forward in strategy as his witness. And I would say this, Jesus says as Christians we're called to be wise as serpents and what? Harmless as doves. We're supposed to navigate the world around us and be smart. Esther is an example of this. Did I read this already? Exception 3, believers often find themselves under multiple layers or levels of governing authority. In such situations, they can appeal to or seek protection from the one that is most sympathetic to their cause. It's just the idea of being wise. You just be wise. Just because there's one law that's laid down, you need to see the big picture and understand, there's in the case of Grace Church, there was the Governor Newsom, but then there's also the President of the United States at the time who was saying you have freedom of religion protected under the Constitution, and that's what they were appealing to, which was hopping over the government's or the governor's mandates and orders that were being handed down for them not to meet. And so anyway, of like kind, you remember the story of Esther, who appealed to the king to overcome the malicious intentions of the lesser authority, Haman. So she did that in Esther chapter 7, and Hushai the Archite pretended to serve Absalom. I read about that earlier today. An illegitimate authority to obey King David. So there was some pretending and faking out to kind of bring David's rule along in that situation. Paul refused and to see it through when Absalom, his son, was performing insurrection. Paul refused to leave Philippi, and this was interesting to me. In Acts chapter 16, it says he refused to leave Philippi and appealed to his rights as a Roman citizen. I looked at that earlier, but it picks up again. Paul appealed to Felix and eventually to Caesar rather than allowing lesser authorities to determine his fate. In Acts 23, verse 12, listen to this plot against Paul. When it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they killed Paul. That's pretty violent. There were more than 40 who made this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and the elders and said, we have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food till we have killed Paul. Now therefore you, along with the council, give notice to the tribune to bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case more exactly, and we are ready to kill him before he comes near. And then through this whole process, Paul becomes aware that there's an ambush. I think his nephew, by Paul's sister's son, warned him of that. And then later it says he was able to contact Felix, verse 23, and he wrote a letter to Felix so that he could appeal to him. It's just being wise, thinking that through. So that's exception 3. Now on to exception 4. In order to stay silent in the face of evil. This is something that we don't have to do. The Bible will say, preach the gospel, and people will say, well, that's hate speech. We need to be quiet. We can't speak up. We have to speak anyway. 2 Samuel 12, the Lord sent Nathan to David. David was confronted by Nathan the prophet. You don't think that was a risk of life and death? That certainly was. David, who had committed murder and adultery, was king. 1 Kings 18, you have Ahab, who saw Elijah, who was forbidding him to go against the prophets of Baal, but Elijah didn't obey that. Remember the story of John the Baptist, who confronted Herodias and Herod for their adulterous affair. Hebrews 11 documents all the prophets who were slain and killed. All of this is, standing up and saying, I will not stay silent in the face of an order to do so. Exception number 4, in order to, I'm repeating myself. This is 4. If a governing authority openly violates the law of God, believers are right to condemn the wickedness of that authority. And then we had looked through the slide. Okay, I got ahead of myself. All right, number 5. In order to turn yourself in, are we always supposed to turn ourselves in? Let's look at this slide. When a governing authority is persecuting the people of God, believers are permitted to flee and hide. They're not to respond with violence, but they are also not required to turn themselves in to a wicked authority. You have, Jonathan who protected David, and David who protected Jonathan. You remember that? You have Obadiah hid the prophets of God from Jezebel, 1 Kings chapter 18, 3 and 4. To read just a little bit. So Elijah went to show himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe in Samaria, and Ahab called Obadiah, who was over the household. Now Obadiah feared the Lord greatly, and when Jezebel cut off the prophets of the Lord, Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid them by 50s in a cave and fed them with bread and water. I mean, this is just undermining governing authorities, protecting the people of God. Joseph and Mary, you remember they fled Herod, who was destroying the Hebrew children that were born. He wanted to kill the Messiah. The Magi had come and they bore gifts to the incarnate Son of God. They worshiped him, and then they went another way. And they hid the reality of seeing the Messiah from Herod, where they were in contract to go back and report. And they went away. And ultimately, verse 16, then Herod, when he saw he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious and sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem. And then later it says, but when Herod died, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, because that's where Mary and Joseph had fled. Rise, take the child and the mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. So there's this navigating of being careful where you don't have to turn yourself in just because you're being ordered to do so. Acts 9, 23 and 25 says, when the days had passed, the Jews plotted to kill, this is Paul at Damascus, but their plot became known to Saul, who was also Paul. They were watching the gates day and night in order to kill him. But the disciples took him by night and let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket. So he escaped persecution at that point. So, just again, This is where we can open it for some Q&A to hear if you guys followed any of this. I know it was very rapid fire. I apologize for how quickly I had to go through all of this. We're going to review it again, over the months, but what questions do you guys have? Because I want to hear what you guys would take away. Exception one, in order to do what is wrong. That's one thing that we, again, have to navigate when we're told to do something that's violating the Bible. We can't do it. Number two, in order to stop doing what is right, when someone's saying, stop preaching the gospel, stop living the Christian life, we have to do it anyway. Exception number three, in order that contradicts another level of civil authority, where one level of authority might tell you one thing, and then is there an appeal process and a way around that and a way to actually still obey the Lord? And we need to think that through as well. Exception number four, in order to stay silent in the face of evil, saying you can't preach, you can't speak up, and we're going to do it anyway. And then number five, the order to turn ourselves in. Sometimes it's right to play by stealth and protect yourselves in the plan and the will of God. So how can I answer any questions from this? What questions do you guys have? Or comments? Yeah.
It just makes me think, it's not exactly in the Bible to not take the vaccine.
Hang on a second. Do we have the mic? Okay, yeah. We're going to have to... I was going to have to repeat but this way.
Just in response to number one.
Yeah.
And it's hard not to think about the COVID period we've all been through. And the courage of the people that decided not to take the vaccine.
Right.
But it's not in the Bible. It's not because of that, I don't believe, that, many refused. But just the courage of them because they felt so strongly it was right to not obey our government. And I don't have a question, but it just makes me think about that.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions with this about obeying God rather than man? Is it just all simple stuff, or?
We got it.
Everybody got it? Yes, all right, here's one, Erica.
The Bible talks about not giving into man's philosophy. Surrounded by that at the school district often. So I have been trying to discern and navigate. I don't really look at what they teach. I've been going by the Bible as to what to do with disciplining children when they're wrong.
Right.
How to correct them in love, teach them the right way by telling them the truth. So the boss is telling me to go and go ahead and learn what you can. And I've been praying, Lord, what do you want me to do? And discern what doors are you opening to be able to stay in this environment and still be a light.
Right.
So is that appropriate way? I guess I don't know.
Well, I think one of the key practical ways to think about applying these different approaches is what is God doing in his providence. Providence, think in terms of the Lord's intervening hand in circumstances where things kind of open up. A lot of times where you are in a work environment, it's good to build trust through integrity, good work, having a good reputation. You're like Joseph, who sort of everything he touched was blessed, and he, even in prison he was blessed, and he was able to give prophecies, and there were appropriate moments where dreams needed to be interpreted, and then when that happened, he gained favor. And I think that happens in work environments where we don't want to try to paint outside the lines, in our flesh. We don't want to push the envelope. We want to build our Christian testimony and our witness without compromise, where we're obeying the Lord and we're doing everything we can do within the bounds of our own conscience, which kind of comes back to your earlier comment. I mean, we have to obey or defy at points within our own conscience. Some people are going to be able to do things or not things in environments according to their own thinking. And then when an opportunity opens up to talk, especially to a leader or a supervisor about your faith in a non-threatening, private way, then that can lead to other conversations or other opportunities that are even sanctioned. And so we don't always have to work covertly. Even asking permission to have, like a Bible or a Christian-sponsored club or something outside of class time, outside of work hours, or for people to know that you're a Christian and then they come to you outside of the, certain hours or whatever, or opportunities where you can give presentations that are personal to you but are, a forum for your faith. Those are ways, I think, that really invite an opportunity. Often a crisis will hit. I know that I've been in secular environments where one in particular where I was a lifeguard and someone died at the ocean, and then all the lifeguards were gathered together, and I think I was 21 or something, and was in Bible college, and the crew chief looked at me and said, "Okay, well, give us a word on this." I was like over the first person that had ever died under this man's watch in 20-some years, and I got to talk very sort of minimally about the sovereignty of God and how he's in control. But, you just never know how the Lord will open the door. I don't know if that helps. What else? I promise I won't make my answers that long again. Yeah, one here.
My question is, some of those 5 points involve discerning whether you think the government was corrupt or doing things that went against God's word. So how would you come to a point at which you think that they have done that? Because I feel like we can look at most governments or authorities and say, well, they're corrupt in this area, so therefore it gives me liberty to disobey in these other areas because they're corrupt. So how would you decide whether that was appropriate or not?
I think that is a very good question, because there's the idea of an individual position and kind of the church position, if I can answer it that way. If it's something that is individual to me, I have to figure that out with my own conscience. I would invite counselors or leaders or friends, people who are fellow Spirit-filled Christians who are Bible-believing, to talk in safe environments where you can debate or think things through, because there are in the Bible stronger and weaker brothers and sisters, according to Romans 14 and 1 Corinthians, I believe it's 10, speak of stronger and weaker, people who could eat meat sacrificed to idols and people who couldn't in the early church, people who are like, I can't go to that party environment with that secular music because that brings me right back to my pre-conversion days. I can't watch that movie. I mean, there are people who have to deal with their own conscience, and the Bible says to not violate your conscience, because to do so would be sin. But then there are other people who view certain things and go, that doesn't affect me. That is clearly the world, and this is my faith, and I'm okay, and I have to navigate that. In the same way, where there are mandates or orders or certain things within your work environment, there are going to be people who say, that violates my conscience, and I can't work there anymore. Or other people who say, I can. And so on an individual level, you have to work that out, both in your own Bible study, referring to leaders and counselors for help within the church. Now, a church as a community and as a leadership, maybe the eldership, needs to be able to think through things like the church is, calling us to shut down, like it did, 3 years ago, where we were having services of only, I think, up to 15 people could be here. And I was preaching 3 times in a row, and it was to a camera, and, some of you were live streaming in, and I enjoyed the challenge of that, but my soul, and James Coates in this book talks about this exact feel. I mean, I was like shriveling up inside, because my whole life is given to ministering open air to preaching and people and life and connectivity, and it was aching, in my heart. And so I think it was good for us as a church leadership eventually to say we're going to operate within reasonable compliance of the kind of spirit of things and comply at levels, but we're going to begin to open up. And right as we began to do that, the orders kind of came off anyway, so it all worked. But eventually we would have just kept meeting no matter what. We had decided that as a full leadership group. So I don't know if that helps. It just takes time, thinking, application. That's why you have all these different categories to think through. Is it time to submit? Is it time to kind of rise above and, obey, God and his governance above man's? What else? Got a few more minutes that I'll push it. Okay.
There is the example in Daniel about the intent of the governing authorities, what they're trying to accomplish. The first one where they were they were commanded to eat the king's meat.
Right.
And Daniel threaded through that, saying, okay,
Yep.
There's a difference between that and when the three were commanded to worship this deity. So there's that example of the difference between what is the intent of the command.
Yep. I think that's super helpful. And they were vindicated in not eating the king's meat, which was kind of a stand of we're not going to let ourselves be indoctrinated into the Chaldean false worship. Any final thoughts? All right. Yep, Tara.
I was just thinking how important it is for us to realize that we might have to have some negative consequences. Like even though they said, even if he doesn't, we still won't worship. So and they were thrown into the furnace. It's not like we can think if we stand up for God, he's just going to make sure there aren't any consequences, and we just get to go along with it. We might have to have some really negative consequences and be okay with that.
Right. Yep. There's definitely been, again, a history of attack and persecution that's been on the church. And as I think about, standing up here, why are we doing this? Why are we educating ourselves? I don't know. The Lord is preparing us for us to be as discerning as possible for whatever's going to come next, or whatever we pass down to the generation that will face a heavier form of persecution. And I love our country. I love the freedoms, and I love being able to speak openly about this in a live streamed forum right now. But none of these freedoms are guaranteed, and I think it's important for us to be biblically solid. We want to be Esther, Ruth. We want to be Daniel. We want to be Joseph. We want to be like Paul. I mean, we just want to be men and women of solid integrity, fortified for whatever will come.